please.
Trustee Cornell.
Here.
Trustee Miller.
Here.
Trustee Mulvaney.
Here.
Trustee Pierce.
Here.
Trustee Thomas.
Here.
Trustee Bree.
Here.
Quorum.
Thank you. Trustee Vree, would you give us a little summation on the Finance Committee report?
Yeah, so Finance Committee met on Wednesday. We went through the current finances for the village, and so far, everything looks good. Basically, all of the funds are on or ahead of plan. The only one that's maybe trending a little bit to the negative would be water, which isn't exactly surprising considering how wet it's been. But general fund, the big one, the village has done a really good job of delaying expenses wherever we can, delaying capital projects wherever we can. There is a lot of uncertainty from Springfield, and so it forces us to be as conservative as possible, and the village is doing a very good job of delaying some of those expenses. So things look very good so far, and we hope this continues. That's the current state of things. The other thing we talked about, and I think this is going to be something that we'll want to talk about again in some more detail, is the beginning of reviewing some long-range projections. Because we are in a state where there are a lot of uncertainties, a lot of areas where there could be some potential changes coming from a financial standpoint for the village, and so we want to do a good job of planning for these things. And so far we've done a first run at some of the long-range planning, using some expectations for what we know currently, and then what our next step will be to start planning for and thinking about contingencies, whether it comes from just economic changes or changes from the way that we receive revenue from the state. The main thing that jumps out just right off the bat, our revenues are growing at a slower pace than our expenses are. And they're growing at a fairly significant, a rate that's fairly significantly slower than the expense rate. And so this is going to be something that will be a challenge for years. We just have an expense base that will continue to grow and grow faster. So one of our plans, and we've been talking about the strategic plan, but this will be one of the areas that we will really have to think about and talk about, how we can sort of squeeze things out of what we've got currently. Whether it's looking at expenses and making sure the money's spent in the right places, or thinking about ways that we can increase revenues. Because as it stands now, in a few years, we're going to have some tough decisions to make based on some of these projections. Those projections also do not include some of the changes that the governor is talking about, and some of the things that may happen out of Springfield, from property tax freezes, from the local government distributive fund potentially getting cut, and some other areas where we just may have a tough road for the next several years. And so far we have started in terms of planning for this to give us time to think about the contingencies and some things that we can do. And so that was a good part of what we talked about at the meeting, and we're going to continue to do that and have talks about the possible contingencies and the possible ways that we can manage through a difficult environment. So those are the two things. That was the meeting. Things are good now from a financial standpoint, and we're just planning for what's going to be a tough state to operate in for the next several years.
Thank you. At the Committee of the Whole this evening, we covered really two topics. One was a presentation by Village Council having to do with the nature of home rule and non-home rule communities under the various constitutions of Illinois, and the special charter of the Village of Glencoe and how it relates to that, just to bring all the trustees up to date to where we are in terms of current Illinois law and the type of village that we are. We also had a short continuation of discussion. We had a workshop on Tuesday looking and discussing the strategic priorities we had coming out of our strategic planning session in 2014, 6 strategic priorities. And we had a workshop to review where we are on those, how they relate to all the various things that the village does, and a discussion of boiling down those to approximately 5 key priorities and how they would relate to future village planning. And so we discussed that in a preliminary way because most of our time was taken up at looking at our village's charter and how it fits into the way in which the law of Illinois governs villages. And so that will continue in future committee of the whole meetings to talk about that and where we are and how it relates to the things that Trustee Vree was just discussing that we face as problems today. The next order of business coming forward is the consideration of our consent agenda. Two things with respect to the consent agenda this evening. The first one is that there has been distributed to all of the trustees some corrections that were made to the minutes of the committee of the whole that are before us. And when we move the consent agenda tonight, we're moving for the adoption of those minutes as amended by the version that was given to you this evening, the corrected version, thanks to Lori having called some issues to our attention that we got fixed up.
And those changes, just so the board is aware, so they can take a look at them, are on the final page of the document, and they are redlined for your benefit.
The other discussion I wanted to mention with respect to the consent agenda, one of the items on the consent agenda tonight is conforming our pool drainage ordinance to the licensing procedure that we have been using for many years with respect to it, that's designed to prevent the discharge or the drainage of pools at year end from causing people to have sewage back up into their houses because we discharge it instead through the stormwater system. And under the ordinance and under the licensing procedure we use, those people who are going to drain their pools at year end are required annually to get a license that has a whole group of requirements in order to make sure that the drainage takes place in conformity with the state and federal law if you're going to drain it into your stormwater system. And one of the things that the board will take up at a later date is I have asked for our staff to prepare a report for the board to look at and discuss on how it is that we implement that policy, how do we police it, and how does all of that work so that we can consider whether we want to make any changes in the future with respect to the methodology that we use. And so that will take place at a later time. Right now, all we're doing is conforming the ordinance to the practice. With that said, is there anything else with respect to the consent agenda that anybody has questions on?
On that. Sorry.
Yes, please.
President Levin, I wanted to reiterate that comment that you were making about the pool, and so the board knows that this is it's a real issue. Pools discharging to the lake, the chlorine can cause adverse impacts on our water, and the waters of the Great Lakes. And so I think with this consent, vote, although we should vote in favor, I will vote in favor. I want to make sure that we do hear from the staff and that we do reconsider at a later date the potential of changing the ordinance back to what the US EPA really does prefer, which is discharge into the sanitary sewer system.
Right, and it actually goes beyond that. There are two aspects. There's one about whether we should continue it this way or do we need to really revamp the village's sanitary sewer system in order to accommodate that type of discharge. But even following the practice that we have now, it's very critical that the adjustments get made. There's rate of discharge, there's pH, there's a whole bunch of things that one has to do to discharge their pool water to make sure that we don't end up putting chlorine into the lake system, which we now do go through those processes, and we want to make sure that those processes are operating properly so that they're accomplishing the needs of this state and federal law, which they are at present. They do conform to. Yes, Laura?
With your permission, may I comment?
Sure.
Thank you. My name is Lori Morse. I live at 271 Hawthorne Avenue in Glencoe, Illinois. Most of you have received a memo from Mr. Crowley on thoughts on this provision of your consent agenda. My advice to you as board members is to ask for this provision to be removed. What you're asking is, being asked, and you can see in your packet right now tonight, is to amend an existing ordinance that protects the lake. Right now, our ordinance reads that if you're going to discharge water from a swimming pool, be your resident or contractor, it has to go into the sewers, the sanitary sewers. That's the law in Glencoe today. And you're being asked to change that law. That law is consistent with other communities and with the regulatory authorities. There was at some point, several years ago before Mr. Corrali, and I don't know how long ago, where because the rate of discharge from these pools was not regulated by staff, there were a few basements that had sewerage backup. And I have to be sympathetic with staff. The worst thing that can happen if you're a staff member in a village, and we have great staff, is to have someone call and say, I've got sewage all over my basement, and then you find out it's because some pool contractor, as quick as possible, pumped a whole bunch of pool water into the sanitary sewers, in compliance with the law that's before you today. So the solution to that problem is to regulate the rate and volume of pumping into the sanitary sewers. Staff, not having board direction on this at that time, chose to just tell the contractors to pump to the lake or the river. And that's been practiced for a number of years, and Bill probably knows, or Dave can tell you. I think at this moment, board is being asked to provide direction of what the right thing to do in this circumstance is. So I urge you to pull this item until we're clear on what the right answer is. And I believe the right answer is to continue, as most communities do, to discharge this pool water into the sanitary sewer with regulations about timing, volume, and velocity. Just saying, oops, let's just put it into the other pipe has not worked for our community. We have had violations of this. There's records of phone calls to the village saying there's chlorine going in. And so let's not try to fix one problem with another problem, and that's my encouragement for you tonight.
Thank you, Laura.
What is the consequence of not conforming the code to practice right now?
Well, right now we do conform to the code, and prior village boards did instruct the staff to proceed in the way in which we have proceeded for many years to avoid the problem of sewerage. The law provides that if you're going to discharge into the storm sewers, that you have to reach certain pHs, your control rate of flow, etc. And the system that the staff uses complies with all that. So we are in compliance with both state and federal law. That doesn't mean that if we could change our sewer system and do it differently, it wouldn't be a good idea to do it. But what we're at right now is all of the licenses have been issued, the permits have been issued. We're going to be going through the season no matter what we do here. It is not a good idea to have our ordinance not in compliance with what we have done for practice for many years. So it's better if we want to enforce it and make sure that they are complying with the requirements of the permits that they get. We are better off to make this change. The reason that we've asked staff to come back and talk to us, because it is far more complex than represented from the audience this evening, all of this, is so that we as a board, prior to the next season, we'll have the opportunity to consider whether or not we want to continue the practice, whether we want to look at changes to the sewer system and the cost and expense of doing those things that would be necessary to make a different methodology for complying with the state and federal law. So my recommendation is we have talked about in committee of the whole when we considered all of this and discussed, is that we go ahead and pass it so that we are in compliance and better able to enforce our licenses, and that we follow the procedure, which is to have staff do the report and go through it with us so that we can satisfy ourselves whether we would like to make a change in an orderly and appropriate manner.
Just to clarify, I wasn't suggesting we weren't following state and federal law. I just wanted to understand what we were operating in right now, which you clarified.
If there are no other questions, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Would you call the roll, please?
Trustee Cornell.
Yes.
Trustee Miller?
Yes.
Trustee Mulvaney?
Yes.
Trustee Pierce?
Yes.
Trustee Thomas?
Yes.
Trustee Vree?
Yes.
We're at that stage in our agenda. If there's any issue that is not on the agenda that a member of the public would like to address us on, this would be the time to do that. Is there anyone who wishes to address something that is not on the agenda? Okay. The next order of business is the village manager's report.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening. I want to start this evening with a brief introduction of Bill Hanson, who is the new Executive Director of Family Service of Glencoe. Bill has it's been, what, a couple of months now that you've been here already?
About 2.5.
And you figured out where all the bathrooms are in the building and all of those good things. So he figured out how to find his way to the board as well. I wanted to give him a second just to introduce himself. We have a wonderfully long history of working together with Family Service of Glencoe. They share the village hall with us. They have some other space as well, but a long-term history. Our public safety department particularly has a very strong relationship with Family Service. So Bill and I have had a chance to get to know one another a little bit, and hopefully more as time goes on, but I wanted to give him a second to say hi.
Thank you. President Levin, trustees, thank you for giving me a chance to introduce myself to you tonight. I'm delighted to be here, and I promise not to take 1 second more than the 45 minutes you promised.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, excellent. So I have the great privilege and honor of being selected to lead Family Service of Glencoe. This is an organization that, and I may be just a little biased in my 2.5 months, but I think it's an outstanding organization that I'm coming into that works very, very hard on behalf of the citizens of this great village. Just a little background about me. I grew up in Northbrook, and I've with my wife, we've raised our family in Deerfield. So 2 North Shore communities, very similar to Glencoe in many ways, a little bit bigger. I attended Loyola Academy. Unfortunately, before it went co-ed, but I survived nonetheless for 2 years there and graduated from Ludwig North. My wife's family moved from Baltimore when she was 12, and they moved into a house on Vernon, right here in Glencoe. So she spent her teenage years at Central School and New Trier High School. I've spent the better part of my 35-year human service career primarily in inner city neighborhoods in Chicago. And there's a really stark contrast when you think about those neighborhoods in Glencoe, particularly when you look through the prism of financial means, wealth, material possessions, and so forth. But when you look through the prism of human service and social and emotional needs, it's really not that different, because we're all humans and we're all people. Our partnership, just want to say a word of gratitude for this partnership that we have with the village. I have found that we work in great collaboration with the village, with public safety. We're honored and proud to partner with the village to meet social and emotional needs right here in Glencoe. We're your premier counseling and mental health organization. We serve all those who live and work in Glencoe regardless of ability to pay. And the need in this respect has also grown. For example, in FY15, we served 267 individuals in our counseling services. 59% of those were assessed on a sliding fee scale as not being able to pay the full rate for counseling services, and 20% of them were assessed to the point where they really could pay nothing for the services, and so we, of course, continue to serve them in line with our mission. In our primary partnership with the village, we responded to 53 calls, crisis calls last year, averaging about one a week. Some of you may know our on-call social worker, Brian McHugh. He's terrific. And you know, oftentimes that crisis is just the beginning of a family's involvement in our service. At a minimum, there's at least one follow-up call or visit to make sure that the crisis is stabilized. In some cases, the families come, they may need continued counseling services with us. In June, I understand one of our staff, Sarah Shirt, came and shared the results of the community-wide needs assessment with the board and whoever else happened to be here. And I just want to let you know we are following up now to address those issues and concerns that were identified through that process. And in particular, there's two main areas where we're focusing program development efforts right now. One of those is in developing alternatives for alcohol and substance abuse recovery. That's a really critical issue for our young people, in particular for teenagers, for young adults, and we're working very hard in that area. And then another area that's been identified is to add some additional services for seniors. That's a population that is significant in this community, and there's a need for additional services there. So our work would not be possible without the partnership that we have with the village and the generous support of the village in this regard. I want to thank you for that. And if you have any questions, I was joking about the village. So, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about the organization.
I thought several of the trustees might need the help of your services when they heard the 45 minutes.
No, but we were going to suggest counseling.
Bill, thank you very much. We are delighted to have you on board, and family services is a very important part of our village. And we're delighted that we have the opportunity to work with you.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Bill. So another opportunity to introduce you all to an important individual in the community. I'm really pleased. This is kind of a fun thing to be able to do once in a while. I'm really pleased to introduce a very impressive young lady. Her name is Molly Bingham. She's a 7th grader at Central, and she's sitting right over there. I'm going to make you come up here and stand at that podium while I talk about you for a minute. She took some very proactive steps to solve a problem in our community. Molly, she's joined by her parents and her sisters. About 6 months ago, she asked to meet with me here in my office to explain that a stretch of the Green Bay Trail that extends from the end of Old Green Bay Road to Hazel Avenue was a safety hazard. She and her family ride their bikes and walk in this area often, and because of the narrow 5-foot sidewalk that existed there, she'd almost been hit and knocked off her bike on a few occasions as bicycle traffic traveled in the opposite direction. So rather than assume that nothing could be done about this issue, along with her family, she took the time to collect dozens of signatures of Green Bay Trail users and delivered those to me with a petition to ask that the trail be widened slightly to improve the safety of this area. She had come up with possible alternatives on how to do this and had done a very nice job even of drafting suggested plans on how we might go about doing what we ended up doing, which was widening the path. Public Works Director Dave Mao and I met and discussed this and acknowledged that this area was certainly one that needed attention. And last month, as you can see on the screen up there, as part of a larger sidewalk replacement contract, I'm pleased to report that an additional 3 feet was added to the width of this section of the trail, in addition to some additional aggregate on the side to help it keep from getting muddy, as was often the case over there. And I think, as a frequent user of that part of the trail, greatly improving the conditions in this area. I really thought it important to acknowledge Molly's efforts. She went above and beyond to address an issue that affected her community and did something that doesn't often happen with our young folks. She took some civic-minded steps to see that the situation was resolved, to work toward a solution that made sense, and made a really salient argument to me when we had a chance to meet back in March. And I think she deserves to be recognized for that. And I just want to reiterate that I'm really proud that she calls Glencoe home. It's really nice that we have kids of her caliber here in this community. So I just wanted to thank you, Molly, and give you a chance to meet the board and be here and understand a little bit more of the civics lesson that I think you taught all of us, is that if you see a problem, you raise your hand and you figure out some ways to deal with it. So thank you for that. And if you have anything you want to say, you're welcome to do so.
Well, just thank you guys so much for helping me with the position that I did and making it happen. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Molly? Molly? I want to go there. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Molly.
you.
Great work.
Obviously, Central does a much better job than when I was a 7th grader.
And thank you to Molly's parents and to her sisters, her sisters joined her in the meeting at Village Hall with me, and they were very, very patient as we talked through a whole lot of interesting things. So it's been a lot of fun. A couple further things that I just wanted to note. The village is going to be conducting a community-wide survey. By late September, residents should keep an eye on their mailbox for a survey from the village asking for input and feedback on village services and suggestions on what priorities deserve some attention in the community over the next few years. It's been a long time since we did a village-wide survey, and we look forward to the valuable feedback that we will be able to receive from the residents. The survey is going to be available both in hard copy and electronically, and so that will allow people to respond either online or in hard copy or through the mail. And once results are compiled, we plan to provide a report to the board and to the community later this fall. If there are questions that come up, those questions can be directed to my office. Finally, Sheridan Road construction. We've all been talking about this for a bit of time, and we do expect that work is going to begin next week. IDOT is fronting this project. It is their roadway, and they have funding approved for this, essentially resurfacing improvement all the way from the northernmost portion of our community at Lake Cook Road to the southernmost portion of Winnetka at Winnetka Avenue. The project involves removal of the existing asphalt surface, completion of necessary base repairs, and resurfacing with new asphalt. Lori left the room, but one of the things that I know is important to her and other bicyclists in the community is that there will be new bike markings that are going to be placed on that roadway, in addition to some signage. There will be some curb replacement here in Glencoe, and then a lot of drainage improvements in the ravine section, which happens to be in Winnetka. It's a very ambitious project for what time remains in the construction season. It does appear that they're going to begin the project here in Glencoe and work their way south, as there is less work to do in Glencoe than there is in Winnetka. We are going to be working closely with them. The corridor will be remaining open to traffic throughout the improvement, and vehicular and cycling traffic may be flagged off of Sheridan depending on what is going on, but there will be signage posted. We are going to also add to some of the signage that IDOT is going to be placing as well. We will have updates on our website, as we always do with construction projects, so people should feel free to use that as a resource. And as we did with Green Bay Road construction earlier this summer, we'll be using Glencoe Connect if necessary, if there are changes that necessitate traffic movement differences and things like that. So that is all I have for my report this evening. Happy to answer any questions that there might be.
Any questions? Okay. Trustee Miller, you had a very interesting plan commission meeting this month. Is there anything
We,
to report on
we
that?
have actually had 2 plan commission meetings since our last village board meeting, because we're working hard to get to the point where we actually can present to the board a revision to the downtown part of the 20-year plan. And I am once again, what we're working on are some things called urban form, which is sort of a visualization of Glencoe in the context of the whole region. We've talked about outdoor spaces, enhancements to outdoor spaces, furniture, signage, lighting, all kinds of really cool things. So I just, mostly what I want to do is to let you know that we're pulling things together at this point, and next month, the chair of our committee, Karen Thomas, will be speaking to the board and will give an overview, and so I really just I think it'll be a lot more interesting and informative to hear the whole thing rather than me giving you little bits and pieces of where we are. So I think you'll find it interesting.
Thank you, Barbara. The golf committee, did you do
We
some reports?
are meeting Monday, so we have not had a meeting since our last board meeting. The only thing I guess I'd like to say, and again is illustration of what Stella does, is just as a for instance, the last month rainfall amounts in Glencoe were 3 inches more than our surrounding suburb. And the kind of havoc that creates for a course is you have to issue rain checks because people can't play. You can't have carts go out, so you move the cart rather than they're a whole series of sort of cascading effects. Nonetheless, for the month, our revenues were approximately the same as budget, but on a year-to-date basis, because Stella has managed the expense side of the equation very well, we are well in advance of budget. And so, weather notwithstanding, so that's basically where we are.
Did you say Glencoe has 3 inches more rain than the surrounding suburbs?
Yes. And this happens, I mean, the way, storms come through, it's sort of like pig pen with a little cloud, sometimes it's concentrated.
Was it a cloud seeding program?
Yeah, no. No defining rods,
I would normally expect Sal to be out there with a pitchfork getting God to cut that down. Thank you. Alrighty, the next order of business is one that's in reality, a great pleasure. We don't always have the pleasure of doing things like this. It is for us to consider the proclamation to proclaim Right in Glencoe Day for October 3rd, 2015. The village of Glencoe has the 3rd largest concentration in the world of structures designed by the renowned American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, including the only Wright-designed subdivision, known as Ravine Bluffs, which was commissioned by Sherman and Elizabeth Booth. Sherman was Wright's lawyer, and Elizabeth was one of the most early advocates of women's rights in the United States, and they both were major supporters of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. Ravine Bluffs includes Wright's only concrete vehicular bridge, plus 3 large concrete planters to mark the entrances to the subdivision, all of which belong to and are maintained by the village. These 3 planters were the model for the outstanding pieces of artwork that the Historic Society has placed throughout the downtown as part of its wonderful Right in Glencoe celebration and featured on this year's vehicle stickers. As we have talked about before, 2014 through 2015 marks the centennial of Ravine Bluffs and are the occasion for the Glencoe Historic Society's launch of its Right in Glencoe year-long, multifaceted celebration of the subdivision and its treasured architect and creator. Our village very much appreciates the Glencoe Historic Society's dedicated group of volunteers undertaking literally thousands of hours of planning, research, writing, and design work that has provided our community with this wonderful Right in Glencoe year-long celebration. The Right in Glencoe celebration will culminate with 3 significant events. The first is the Right Around the Table dinner tomorrow night, when a limited number of guests will dine at the Booth House in an intimate gathering that welcomes home to Glencoe several of the Booth grandchildren, who will share stories behind the Booth House as they recall their visits to their grandparents. The second event will be on Sunday, September 20th, when the Glencoe Historic Society will host the Right in Glencoe House Walk, which will provide a very rare opportunity to experience a guided tour of Ravine Bluff Wright-designed Glencoe homes, and the opening of a special exhibit on Right in Glencoe, including some never-before-seen photographs and drawings. All of this will culminate with the third event on October 3rd, when the Glencoe Historic Society will hold the Ravine Bluffs Centennial Gala, featuring a live auction of the Right Around Town markers that have been on display throughout downtown all summer. In honor of all the outstanding work that the Glencoe Historic Society has done, I am tonight asking my board to join with me in issuing a proclamation honoring the Society and its members for all of their extraordinary work and dedication throughout the centennial, and proclaiming October 3rd Right in Glencoe Day. May I have a motion to adopt the proclamation?
So moved.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? There being no opposed, we were delighted to have created the proclamation. Do you have a copy for me to give to my friend?
I don't have the fancy copy because it's fairly long, and so we're working on a way to fit it into a more presentation worthy. I do have a 2-page version over here that I'm happy to present to you, Ed, tonight, if you'd like it.
Yeah, I asked a question.
You know, he's from the Historical Society, you never know, it might go into. Great work, it's been fabulous, people have really been enjoying, you know, the public display, so. Looking forward to more.
We've enjoyed bringing everything.
It is a great pleasure to give you that. I look forward to bringing the original and being able to read it at the October 3rd celebration. You guys have done a phenomenal job. I remember over a year ago when I got the pleasure of being at the meeting where you were outlining all these things you were going to accomplish, and I was wondering how can anybody get all that done? But you guys have done a phenomenal job. The society and all of its members are terrific. You've done a great credit.
We're starting to wonder the same thing. Can I make a couple of?
Yes, you may.
On behalf of the board of the Historical Society and our volunteers, and the Right in Glencoe committee, I want to thank President Levin, the village manager Crawley, and the board and staff for working with us over this past year. This particular series of events has been almost 2 years now in the planning, and started actually about a year ago this month with our first presentation at the library. So it's been quite a year. If you've noticed the lights burning late at night over at the front building at the Historical Society, it's because we frankly right now resemble a family of chipmunks on Red Bull, trying to get the exhibit mounted in time for Sunday. So we're looking forward to this next few weeks and the events that are happening. And again, thank you for this recognition.
I wanted to mention as part of my report that the Community Grant Committee will be consisting of Trent Cornell and Jonathan Bree, who along with myself will meet with all of the people who are seeking grants this year. Sometime in December, we'll get all the material and interview all of them so that we can put together a recommendation to the board as part of the budgeting process as to where we are with grants for the coming fiscal year. So that meeting will take place, and staff will be in touch setting it up with everybody involved for sometime early in December. The other matter is that our next board meeting will be October 15th. And we're looking forward to everybody surviving tonight so that we can be here. The next order of business is consideration of the ordinance repealing and reestablishing Chapter 4, which is the alcoholic beverages of the portion of the village code, reclassifying the current liquor license system and updating that whole area of the code. And Sharon Tanner will give us a full understanding of all of this, a little presentation, just to refresh us.
Thank you, President Levin and Board of Trustees. This evening before you, we have an ordinance for your consideration amending, as President Levin had mentioned, repealing and reestablishing Chapter 4, which is the village's liquor code, to incorporate several substantial amendments that we began discussing earlier this summer in committee of the whole with the board. The item before you this evening is a product of our discussions in June, July, and August, and incorporates the feedback that we've received from the board thus far. A bit of background on the village's liquor code. The liquor code was comprehensively written in the mid-1970s. In the mid-1980s, it underwent several substantial amendments, and then throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, there were individual or piecemeal amendments that were made throughout the code, primarily focusing on some of the classifications. The current code is a product of all of these amendments to the 1970s draft. That contains 22 different classifications, some of which are fairly narrowly drafted to address very specific types of uses or types of businesses. As a result of that, different types of businesses may not necessarily fit within those classifications. Throughout the amendment process as well, there are several common practices that had not been incorporated into the code that are quite common today in municipal liquor codes. As a result of all of that, staff and the village attorney began reviewing the code comprehensively in 2015 with the goals of streamlining, modernizing, and improving the code, which we will discuss here shortly. Throughout the committee of the whole discussion process, we received affirmative action from the board regarding incorporating some new terms applicable throughout the code that are, I would characterize as fairly common among different liquor codes. We won't discuss these in great length, but to summarize, the liquor liability insurance requirement that will be added, a requirement for servers to undergo responsible server or BASSET training is a common program that's offered by the state, to conduct background checks for renewal applications, adopting a prohibition of alcohol in public places, however excluding permitted special events and permitted outdoor dining areas, and automatically reducing the number of license upon lapse of the license. We discussed several changes to terms of the existing liquor code. First, we'll talk through the food service requirement that's related to on-premise consumption businesses. Currently, restaurants are required to serve complete meals after more than 2 drinks are served. Based on our discussion at the committee of the whole, we produced a draft that has a different food service requirement, which is for businesses where the sale of alcohol is incidental and complementary to the service of food. The sale or service of food must be available rather than the affirmative requirement of complete meals after 2 drinks. To the extent that the board would like to consider other types of uses that are on-premise consumption businesses without a food service requirement, we would recommend adopting separate classifications, which we'll talk through shortly. Next, we discussed fees. Currently in the code, each license classification has a fee that's assigned to it. In some cases, the fee is based on the size of the liquor service area or sales area if it's a retail venue. And in lieu of that, we're recommending that we determine the fee in those cases based on the percentage of gross sales that are attributed to alcohol, with a higher fee if at least 15% of gross sales are attributed to alcohol, and a lower fee if less than 15% of sales are attributed to alcohol. We discussed the village's current prohibition of BYOB at restaurants. The feedback we had received from the board was to expand the BYOB prohibition to include all businesses that are licensed, business license holders, that is, within the village of Glencoe. We also discussed special events. Currently the code is a bit unclear as to when a special event requires a temporary liquor license. To add clarification to that, we're recommending codifying that if the event offers either alcohol for sale or if the event is open to the general public, it would require the license for special events, for the liquor license, that is. If both the event is not open to the general public and alcohol is not offered for sale, it would not require a temporary liquor license. Yes?
Thank you. Would a business be allowed to have a special event which allows BYOB? So in other words, we're prohibiting BYOB at restaurants and all businesses is the recommendation, but can a restaurant host a special event where BYOB is allowed?
If the new ordinance was adopted as drafted, the answer would be no. Next, moving on to tastings. Currently, the code allows established businesses that have a license for the retail sale of packaged goods for off-premise consumption, such as a grocery store, a liquor store, a business of that nature, to offer tastings of wine only, though the code does not specify the serving size of wine that can be offered for tasting. Our recommendation would be to expand the types of beverages that can be served as tastings to include beer, wine, and spirits, and to set forth limits of what can be poured as a tasting by a business that holds that off-premise packaged goods sales license to include 16 ounces of beer or 4 ounces of wine or 1 ounce of spirits per person. Next, I'd like to review the proposed revisions to the license classifications. As we went through the drafting process, so I do want to note that some of the classifications had different letters assigned to them when we discussed them in the committee of the whole. As we drafted, we did reorder some of the licenses to try to improve the clarity of reading the code comprehensively. So the result is there's a different lettering schema. However, the substance of these has not changed other than one minor exception to the performance theater license that I'll mention in a brief moment. I do want to mention as well that after the August committee of the whole meeting, staff created a page on the village's website with information about proposed changes to the liquor code, and also sent letters to our current liquor license holders advising them of how the code changes may affect them. Class A licenses, as presented on the slide here before you and in your packet, are for businesses whose primary purpose is on-premise consumption without the sale or service of food necessarily. This is akin to what's commonly referred to as a tavern license. If this classification is implemented, staff would recommend a fee of $4,000 for beer and wine service and $5,000 for spirits, beer, and wine. At the committee of the whole, there was some discussion of this item, and if the board wishes to continue discussion of it, we can amend as the board may wish to do so. And that goes not only for the Class A, but for all of the items that we're discussing this evening.
I have a question. You said that there was something that was sent out to the current holders.
Yes.
What was the feedback?
We received one question from, again, which is the performance theater license. We received one question about how a request that they had to change, which we'll address on the next slide. And there was one additional question from one of the country clubs. I think Dave received a letter, so I'm going to ask him to wait.
Sure. Yeah, we received some feedback from one of the country clubs in town, just asking about one of the proposed classifications being the on-premises and off-premises, and perhaps their desire to move to that upon their renewal period. Those were really the two pieces of feedback that we
Maybe
received.
fair question.
Exactly, exactly.
Moving right on to the next classification here, Class B, which is incidental on-premises consumption, which is a license that would allow consumption of alcohol on the premises. Pardon me, there's a typographical error on that side, I apologize, it should read with the sale and service of food. My apologies for that. That would apply to restaurants, golf courses, country clubs, and we would, in addition to the fee amounts that are listed here, we would recommend adding a different fee for municipally owned golf courses to remain consistent with the current license. As you look at the slide, you see that there are two prices listed for each class for both beer and wine and full bar. As I'd mentioned earlier, we're recommending determining the fee based on the percentage of sales. The lower amount you see would be reflective of businesses that have less than 15% of sales attributed to alcohol, and the higher amount would be if the service of alcohol amounts to at least 15% of your total sales. Moving on then to Class C, which is a consumer, pardon me, yes.
So for B, the $1,000 being annual fee for a business that over 15% of its gross revenues are related to the sale of alcohol?
If they have that B1, which is for beer and wine service only.
Okay,
If it was,
that just strikes me as low, or is that consistent with other villages or municipalities?
it's consistent with how we've previously charged that fee. However, I will say that all the fees are certainly something that we can revisit and we can study further if the board would so like, or if there are different amounts that we'd like to review, we can certainly do that.
I think one thing I'd add is that when we did do the comprehensive fee survey of our neighboring communities, we found that in many cases we were in the middle of the pack, in many cases we were right around where everyone else was too. So I think in this particular circumstance, this was a fairly typical fee. You're not seeing fees of many thousands of dollars in this particular classification.
I don't know, it just seems low if it's over 15% of your gross revenue. That's $1,000 a year for beer and wine.
The way it used to be classified, as Sharon mentioned, if you want to walk through it used to be 15% floor area, if I recall correctly.
It varied based on the classification. As I mentioned earlier, we had 22 different classifications and they were pretty tightly written to specific uses. So I don't think I can answer with a blanket statement of that.
My recollection is in looking at this in both surrounding and other communities, wherever more than 15% of your revenues were derived from alcohol, or that our fees are extremely low compared to what you would expect outside of our particular area. And my recollection is from the discussion in the committee, since we were looking at this and being very business friendly, those fees certainly would not cause anybody to think about going to another separate, because it's such a small amount in comparison to the benefits when you sell that level of alcohol. The margins are much, much higher.
Class B would be, to expand on this, would be incidental and complementary to the service of food. Class C is a new classification that we're offering for the board's consideration, and it would provide for on-premise consumption without the sale or service of food in conjunction with retail services. Staff received a request several weeks ago, or an inquiry from a business several weeks ago that plans to open in town shortly, offering salon-type services that inquired about the feasibility of being able to sell a glass of wine or a glass of champagne while receiving salon services. That's an example of a use that doesn't currently fall within our code, though this classification C would allow that type of use. And in this case, we're recommending a fee of $250 if beer and wine is served, or $500 if spirits, beer, and wine are served.
Is that where the Starbucks would fit in as well?
No. Starbucks has service of food.
Oh,
along
okay.
with-
This would be again more like salons, nail salons, that type of use. Class D would license off-premise consumption businesses that sell packaged goods at retail. So again, your grocery stores, liquor stores, businesses of that nature. Again, recommending a fee of $1,000 or $1,500 for beer and wine, and $2,000 or $3,000 for spirits, beer and wine. Class E is for special events. Events would be hosted by educational, political, civic, fraternal, religious, or nonprofit organizations. The license would be valid for a period of 8 hours, and as I mentioned earlier, the license would be required if alcohol is sold or if the event is open to the general public. And thinking about alcohol being sold, that would include things like a cash bar, drink tickets for which cash is paid, or if there are complimentary drinks offered with a paid admission, some sort of exchange of money for the service of alcohol. We would recommend a fee of $50 per day, which is the current fee. Next is Class F, which is for live performance theater that serve alcohol for on-premise consumption that's incidental and complementary to a live stage performance. Currently, this license classification allows service 1 hour prior to the performance and during intermission. And the new request that I mentioned earlier is service 1 hour after the performance or until midnight, whichever is earlier.
So G or F?
In the new numbering, or excuse me, lettering scheme, it's up. It's formerly Class G.
Right.
Yes. So this, again, we would recommend maintaining the existing fee of $200. Next, we have Class G, which is a combination of on-premise and off-premise consumption license. It's generally a new classification, though it expands a bit on some of the terms of the former Class J and L licenses that aren't currently in use. It would allow on-premise consumption as well as the sale of packaged alcohol for off-premise consumption. So perhaps a wine bar or a restaurant that offered packaged goods for sale would be examples of something that may fall within this category. If the board would like to have a food service requirement that applies to this, we could certainly amend the draft ordinance to provide for that. We'd recommend a fee of $1,000 or $1,500 for beer and wine, or $2,000 or $3,000 for spirits, beer and wine. Last is Class H, which is a new classification. It would allow brew pubs and craft breweries to operate within the village and provide on-premise consumption of alcohol, as well as the sale of packaged goods for off-premise consumption. As I mentioned, it would permit alcohol production facilities with some production limits that are set forth in the draft ordinance. Brew pubs within an adjoining restaurant may sell up to 50,000 gallons per year, which I believe is about 1,600 barrels for off-premise consumption. The draft ordinance is presented to you. It contains language to also allow that limit to increase if the state law that also regulates it increases. I will say that the state law has recently changed. That limit has nearly tripled to 155,000 gallons per year. If the board's preference is to continue to allow the limit to index according to the state law, we can leave the ordinance as drafted. If your preference is to maintain a different limit, we can amend it to do so. Craft breweries would also be allowed under this classification, which may have a tasting room or a restaurant adjoined to it, and may produce up to 930,000 gallons per year of beer, which is approximately, I believe, 30 or 31,000 barrels, and may self-distribute up to 232,500 gallons per year, and I did not do the math. I apologize on how many barrels that equates to.
I just have one question.
Yes.
What's the difference?
Between a craft brewery and a brew pub?
Yeah.
Attorney Alright, I may ask you to chime in on
Yeah.
this.
$1 a glass.
There's a general distinction and a more distinct distinction. A craft brewery is considerably smaller and brewed on premises. The other category there, it may not necessarily be on premises. This is, I think, one of the basic distinctions, maybe broader than that.
I think some of those distinctions too are the amount that can be distributed for off-premise consumption, as well as the brew pub would have an adjoining restaurant to it, whereas a craft brewery may or may not.
It may be
have,
simply,
it may have a tasting room associated with it. My understanding is that one of the primary differences, though, in addition to what Attorney Laura had said, is that the amount that can be distributed for off-premise consumption.
My recollection is the one is actually producing product which is intended to be sold to other restaurants or food stores and things of that nature, and so they,
more,
Yep.
more common of a typical brewery as opposed to a pub.
correct.
Do we really need to put that in an ordinance now? Couldn't that just wait until there's an opportunity to remain silent on the group of craft breweries?
I
What
think,
value does it have to put it in there? I mean, if somebody comes with an idea, wouldn't we adjust it?
I think in the committee of the whole, the thought process was that people who are thinking of doing some of these things look at your code to find out what you're permitted to do in your village. And by creating the category, it was more inviting to have the opportunity for somebody who's interested in it to realize they could come to Glencoe and do that.
Could you say TBD?
Hmm?
Say TBD? To be, I mean, because some of these things that are in there, so my business model is 60,000 gallons a year, darn, I'm not going to Glencoe. I mean, it just doesn't seem like it's going to suit the purpose.
We certainly can, it truly is a matter of how the board would like to proceed or not proceed with it. We can include it, and one of the things I'll note later in the presentation is that an action by the board this evening or at any point in time on the matter would also include an amendment to the number of licenses that are authorized. This would be set at 0, since there are no licenses currently for it. That would be something that would be within the board's discretion to review in the future as well.
I think that that's an important point to note, that we are continuing to recommend that Glencoe have a two-level or actually a three-stage form of regulation. One being the content, the category that's in your ordinance, that which you would consider adopting tonight. Second being the number, which also would have to go back to the village board, and anything you can set it whatever, but whatever number, making sure that it's the maximum number that you want available, and that there's no additional amount available. So every action would have to come before the village board. And then third, a review by the liquor commissioner to confirm that the other standards for issuing the license are applicable. In respect to your specific question of whether we put something in the code now or later, it's a very good question, and you should look at that with respect to each of these categories. Putting it in, not having anything in the code now, may or may not send a signal of what the village would like or is considering, knowing full well that in any case, board action is required. So it really is, it's a policy decision for you all to make to determine whether if you want to have the category in there with no licenses available or no category at all.
I have a similar, analogous, I think, question. I've been mulling over our Class A license, and maybe some of the others as well, with regard to our not requiring the service, not the service, but the availability of food. So Class A, which sometimes is called a tavern license, someone could request that we license them and not even put out a bowl of popcorn or peanuts. Now, I think, I am interested in the question that our attorney is asking us to consider. It's sort of a policy question of, do we put it out there as something that we might allow, knowing that we do have the discretion at a future time not to allow it? Or do we say, no, we're going to say that come to us, talk to us, we'll move quickly, we're business friendly if there's something you wanna do that's not in our code. But right now, we don't envision it for our community. I had not thought about the question with regard to brew pubs. I had thought about it in terms of a tavern with no peanuts or popcorn. And maybe it is the same kind of question. I know we had specifically discussed the Class A at our committee of the whole meeting, and I didn't remember that we had come to the conclusion that we would leave it, that we would have it that way. And so I am curious what other people think about this policy question. My instinct is, at least with the Class A, because first, partly I don't think anyone is going to want to sell liquor that way. I don't want to put it out there as us being a community where we want to have a tavern with no peanuts or popcorn. But I'm very curious as to board reaction.
There's another theme in the dialogue which was tied back to the catalyst, being that there is an opportunity to clean out, modernize, streamline the code. So part of what perhaps we're wrestling with here is the idea that we wanted to create a wide net to anticipate what types of establishments over time could come to pursue a liquor license, and try and come up with something that was pretty comprehensive in terms of what could potentially come our way. But that's very different than making a commitment to bring anybody on board. So part of our sensitivity too is to not rewrite code every year or do a bunch of one-offs, and to think more long-term and more process-centric about how do we think analytically about what we need, put something in place and be able to live with it because we were inclusive and comprehensive. But the decision authority to greenlight anything doesn't go away in doing this.
To Barbara's point too, is without sale or service of food, literally meaning you can't put out.
Not that they can't, but they would have the option now. They wouldn't have to.
Right now, well,
Say, I don't know, I'll ask Steve to kind of.
well,
I think
it's a policy question, but right now, the service of food is required. And this would make the service of food optional.
Yeah, but I mean, my guess is the market effectively requires, peanuts and popcorn or something as a practical matter. I've never been in anything called a tavern that didn't have this stuff. I'm not sure whether that was strictly because they had a license requirement or whether
It's revenue.
it was revenue.
There are some municipalities that require the service of cooked food or prepared food, so that the service of peanuts would not qualify.
I
guess that's good.
A honey glazed.
I think if we're trying to come up with a generic list of categories that's fairly comprehensive, this covers it. If we want to use this as a preliminary screen to prejudge what we will allow or not allow, that's a different decision criteria. So, the answer to your question, my look at this was, is it generic and is it comprehensive? It passes that test. But right now, we have nothing in front of us for approval, so this doesn't tie to taking any action.
No, I recognize that. It's really a concern about what statement we're making.
I should comment, we do have an ordinance drafted before us that's this ordinance. We do have before us an ordinance that's this ordinance, I think.
Of course we do, but action on that ordinance, certainly the ordinance could be modified prior to the board taking any action on it.
Correct, but that's why the question arises, just as Scott is pointing out, do we want to go ahead and act on the ordinance, and that's a fair discussion and one that we should have. Do we want to act on it with the idea that we're going to create the categories that we would consider, knowing that we haven't made a decision to actually permit it? That will come to us with a specific instance in mind where we can judge it and see what the community thinks. Or do we want to, in effect, exclude certain categories on the grounds that we don't think we would consider it, and therefore, unless there's some real reason to do it, then we would be back to the one-off type of thing, where we would be amending the statute to add the correct category as well as considering the license.
Yeah, we repeat this like.
So I think the first question before we talk about should we amend the ordinance in front of us is really the very question that Scott was posing. Is our philosophy that we want to go ahead and, for example, where we had discussed and thought, well, if we had a brew pub that really wanted to come here, we would be willing to think about it. Do we want to include that so that if one wants to come here, we then are merely asking ourselves, do we want to grant the license under that category? Or do we want to say, okay, we're not really going to do that, we're going to go back to the practice if a brew club came here to actually amend the statute and create the category and then grant the license. And the two places where that was very much discussed in our committee of the whole had to do with taverns. Do we want to make a major change in our policy that says we would consider it? That doesn't mean we would grant one, but we would consider a tavern. And the other was the last category, which was the brew pub or brewery situation. So I would think the first thing that we should talk about and make a preliminary concept on, so we know whether to be thinking about a statute that we amend to take those two categories out, is which philosophy do we think is the best philosophy to pursue at this time? And so I leave that to, Peter, you may want to.
Sure, well, my initial thinking was that, do we think a code like that would attract a brew pub or detract? Do we know what a brew pub is looking for? If we look at Scott's things, I totally agree to be inclusive, we have all these logical categories in the world that we can think of, but if it's used as sort of some kind of marketing ploy, I don't see that as being an effective reason for putting it in the code. If we see it as this, let's be inclusive and let's just make sure our codes avoid extra work in the future, maybe it works, but I suspect any brew pub that comes to town is going to want to change that code.
That may only be the case if we put in provisions different than that of the state. Right now, the way the ordinance is written is to tie to the state's regulation of it. If the board, you're looking at me funny.
I'm only saying, and we can only, as a non-home rule municipality, do what that is.
I thought I was saying something.
No, I just tied into an earlier conversation.
So put it a different way, putting aside home rule, no other municipality could compete for our business based upon a different set of criteria for the people. Is that correct?
That was a big precatory statement.
Yes. It was you want to whereas was.
Some of those yes and no's.
There are two answers to it, and you just take your choice.
Right.
So it doesn't sound like it's any differentiating value, right, from what you're saying.
Well, I think it also doesn't have any negative value.
There's no immediate consequence
Yeah.
to doing it.
And that's why the real issue is, do we want to have these included in the code, and then we make the decision when we have something real to look at? Or do we want to, and that would then require us to go through the discussion and decide we're going to add the category? Or are we perfectly happy saying we don't even need to have the category for either taverns or brew pubs type thing? So
I think we need to be reminded of I'll speak only for myself here, the lack of a crystal ball. And retail is particularly frenetic, if you think about that industry. So if you were to go back 10 years ago and say, would you allow a burrito shop in town to serve beer? You'd probably say no, but if Chipotle wanted to move in, we'd probably say yes. So I don't think we can anticipate what kind of businesses may approach us.
That was what I was gonna say, is that this was what amended in the 70s, the 80s, and ad hoc since then. All we're doing is opening up to whatever categories we think might be there in the future. So when we say we, we're actually referring to the we of 10 years from now. And that's the we will make a specific decision granting a particular license.
If I may, if I could add on to Attorney Alred's
looming large.
Looming larger by the day is, that category references specifically sales. Right?
For the fee,
Yes.
no,
No.
that one is a flat dollar amount fee.
But doesn't it, at least as I was reading the actual, not what's up here, but when reading the actual text, it
It's for
refers solely
sale.
to sales.
Yeah, it's for sale. It's cash bar type situation.
Right.
Yeah.
So for said Black Performance Theater, that, at least if they follow past practice, will have both sales at a cash bar and other events where alcohol is provided. Are they licensed or are they breaking the law if they continue past practice? This is the code provision they follow.
I apologize, I misunderstood your question, so.
They need a special event license for those occasions then?
Suppose they have a thing where they invite a bunch of people to come see a special performance, or even just have a discussion of this is the kind of play they want to have, or a women's library club meeting. They wouldn't be licensed under this category to serve because there's no performance.
There's no sale either.
And there may not be a sale. So it would seem to me then they'd have to have some sort of different license for the event. They might fall under the special event category.
That's exactly, that's what they.
And that's what I would have
That's how
assumed
those
we were anticipating.
Yeah, that would be a special
Which would
event.
be another fee and another license.
Right.
And another application.
Okay.
Per occurrence.
Per occurrence.
But it probably needs to be made clear to them, I think. Yes.
Now, it would be per occurrence. There's a possibility, there are blanket special event for entities that have special events on a regular basis. They're,
Well,
but we haven't considered.
I think the question also may be, what type of meeting are you talking about? For instance, as we look at the special event permit, it's really required if alcohol is sold or if the event is open to the general public. If these are closed events, invitation-only type events, then they would not be required to get a special event permit.
Invitation only and no sale.
And no sale, correct. So for instance, if there were a meeting of the board of the particular theater that we're discussing, that would not be an open event necessarily. They're not required to have that be an open meeting. And alcohol would not likely be for sale in that certain circumstance, and so they would not be required to get a special event permit.
But it falls into the private party.
Correct.
Right.
This was excellent timing, as my very last slide was to inquire as to whether there were any questions into hearing feedback from the board. As Manager Crowley noted, there is a draft ordinance. That said, we're happy to take the board's feedback, revise the ordinance for future consideration if that's the board's purview, or we could act in any number of ways that the board chooses to do so.
One
Don't.
question.
I have a question, going back to Barbara's, comment on the taverns and the units and the, I guess as I recall, it says, just without the sale or consumption of food. Are we really talking about without prepared food? In other words, I guess if there is this ambiguity about pretzels and peanuts and stuff, and I don't know, most taverns I've been in, maybe it's built into the price of the drink, but I'm not being sold those pretzels, or, as a separate matter. So I just wonder what we, about our question, whether there's a way to make it clear.
If I may, I think it would be helpful if you tell us what you want.
Well, I don't want to be precluded, I guess
We
personally.
could draft it any way you want.
Yeah, personally, I would not want something that could be construed to say, well, I don't have to offer peanuts or whatever. I can't imagine why anybody would do that, but I also wouldn't want an ordinance that in effect is read as saying,
the question is, right now, it's more than just service of food, it's actually requiring a kitchen where food is prepared, and so that's
with the shorthand there, but I apologize, because
that's more of the distinction.
I haven't read through
This
that.
would eliminate the need
okay.
for having
Then I
a
don't-
kitchen where food is prepared and
then I
consumed
don't-
on the premises.
It would not preclude, certainly, them having food available that was of a packaged nature or something like that.
Okay.
It just would not require them to do so.
Doesn't have to be part of a restaurant, and a restaurant has a definition that includes a kitchen where food is prepared for consumption on the premises.
So two, we're talking about slightly different things, but I gather the ordinance talks of it, because I haven't read it, so my apologies, but it mentioned having a restaurant, so in effect, that's packed into that language without food.
That was packed into the language. Now, in this particular class that you're talking about, the restaurant component
Has been removed.
has been removed. So it's not necessary to have it for that particular class of license.
As the ordinance reads such that the incidental sale or service of food is permitted but not required in a Class A licensed establishment.
That's pretty much.
So you could have it with sandwiches or any
Yeah,
one
no,
of the number of
it's,
things.
it's, you know, as a start matter, no one was up there, right? It's outside, it didn't seem to have that number zero.
Sure.
But we were not precluded from rejecting anything that falls into the bizarre camp.
Correct.
Right, because your number will be zero.
Yeah.
And so they'd have to convince the
And-
board that we want it to
And that
create
is
a
a
license.
completely discretionary, that increase is complete discretion. It is not subject to arbitrary, I mean, it's complete discretion.
Because it's a legislative determination.
All we're saying is we'll consider a number of things, but we're not committing to anything.
Correct.
I'd like to bring up the BYOB again, for special events. That is something that we aren't actually precluding, it's the only thing that we actually say no in all categories, right, no BYOB.
No BYOB in a restaurant or business. But if there was a special event, a private party of some type, I believe, Steve, that would be,
Well, we answered no to your question earlier.
Yes, but a club could not have a bring your wine cellar event. Bring your own wine cellar wines and come to the club here and we're gonna have an event like that. Or a restaurant that says.
When you say
bring
a
your
club,
own
do you-
food.
do you-
Country club.
okay. I wasn't sure if you meant like a social club
Oh,
or
yeah,
something
no,
like that.
so the category of club up there, so. So it seems like that's something that we're excluding, but I could imagine it being something that businesses would.
The
Private
theory,
events are not precluded.
Yeah, that's still private.
but the theory is that under the circumstances you're imagining, it falls within the category of it's much harder to control and enforce the law when you're trying to take liquor away that belongs to somebody as opposed if you're making a decision when you're serving them a drink.
Sure, but a license could have the condition of X, Y, and Z to make that easier, right, maybe costly to them.
Well, it may be even harder. For example, a restaurant has a hard time controlling it because the people that have to control it want the tip from the person who brought their own bottle, so that's one of the reasons why you don't do it.
So on a special event and you wanna have a BYOB, you're gonna know about these issues, right? And that's gonna be built into the business plan of having a special event where, come and whatever it is. I chose, country club, but let's say it's a shoe store that wants to have a bring your own wine. Whatever, taste your wine from your cellar and share that, right? So whatever provisions would be in this license, or the concerns that we have would be in the provisions of the license.
It still is very hard for them to enforce the normal facet training under those circumstances. That's why most communities like Glencoe don't permit it.
Okay, I see, not a lot of support for this, so. That's fine.
We're trying to make it easy, but at the same time, we're trying to make sure that it's safe.
That, not only sound here, which isn't the case, but as I look at those live performance movies, I don't know why it troubles me so much, possibly because we were earlier talking about the fact as a non-home rule community, we don't have mechanisms to
So we have a much higher number for the theater because of the number of people that they sell liquor to versus a little shop. So if we wanted to get proportional revenue from each license holder, then we would tie it back to their aggregate sales level for
I'm talking
alcohol.
about one specific license holder which happens to fall into one category. There's not going to be another, well, there would be another live performance theater, but there's only one now.
No, but that disproportionality there is resident in some other categories because of how the pricing is developed.
I'm only talking about one.
The note I
know
would,
what this one is.
the one thing I would note with Writers Theater is I believe that the pricing structure that we did not change, the staff did not modify from revision, from the existing version of the code, relates to the fact that it's a not-for-profit organization. That does certainly not preclude the board from making modifications to that licensing fee, but just to give you the context, I believe that was how that was set when it was set.
Just as not-for-profit, if we are putting the entertainment tax on it, so I'm not sure that goes very far.
Well, it depends, because that if, to use that example, that would likely be paid by others as opposed to by Writers Theater themselves.
And you don't think Writers Theater passed along by charging an extra quarter?
I'm not hypothesizing on that, I'm just saying that I do see there is some difference given that we can do one and we can't do the other, so.
Do we know, I know Chicago Shakespeare has liquor available for admission beforehand.
It's a fairly typical.
Yeah, and do we know what kind of license fees they charge, so forth, how they do it?
Do we know anything on?
For something
Oh, go
like
ahead. Sharon, you look like you might have an answer to that.
I have an answer, but the answer is we don't have that information.
She has an answer.
That's an answer.
I claim to have an answer, I claim to have the answer.
But Trent, I agree
Yes,
with you, that number is surprisingly low.
Right, and especially given the discussion we had earlier about how they're a high cost item to the village, and therefore we would like to have some way to recover some of
I
the
mean, it does
costs.
seem it shouldn't take long to look into a few of these other examples to see, how they did it.
It's not punitive, it would be a potential recovery mechanism, and Lord knows there's a strong partnership between the village and Writers Theater. Something to consider, that's all.
Are you talking about a higher fee or a percentage?
Yes.
A higher fee.
Higher fee.
Or either way.
Can you treat it as a percentage without it being considered a tax?
I would have, well, I
100%
If you said, if you sold $50,000 worth of alcohol, you have to pay 1% of it, as a fee?
We're venturing into different territory.
I haven't researched it.
And I would argue that now we're creating something completely different than what we've been talking about with our retail sales, where you're not building a sliding scale that if you sell $1 million worth of alcohol versus $500,000, you're now gonna pay substantially more. If that's the direction the board wants to go, I think we need to take some steps back.
The only thing about the different categories from my standpoint is a little bit more of an analysis on what we're charging. I have no idea, I mean, every fee to me seemed a little low, but I could be way off, I just don't know what.
It did to me too, and then I thought about it, I'm like, what if we have two restaurants or four
Right,
restaurants,
and
I don't know what range.
to encourage business, I also don't wanna discourage anything by throwing a big fee right up front, saying you gotta pay us to do anything. I'm saying, but I just.
might I recommend, it would not be uncommon to look at this, sort of in a bifurcated way, that look at the substantive regulations, which, quite frankly, is the dog here, and the fees, in effect, are the tail, and.
Do you have to pass an ordinance every time you change the fees? Does that require a full ordinance?
No, we can
Change
change
of
the
a
fee
fee resolution.
schedule, which is in a fee ordinance, and so the rational way to do this is to pass what we have here, and for us to say to staff, we're going into our budget stuff, we would like you to take a look at what theaters charge and review all of these fees, so that as part of our budgeting process, you come back and you're gonna look at recommending changes in a whole host of village fees. We look at these along with the others, and then we can deal with the fees on the merit.
So then we get back into a flat fee
Yeah.
that equates proportionally.
Right. And you'll also have, you'll also have in front of you a schedule of all fees,
Right.
not just fees, and opportunities for other things.
And that is a process we undertake annually, as President Levin said, as part of the budget process, and we're in the midst of gathering data on all of our fees to do some comparables with that for your discussion.
So with that said, just to confirm what you're describing, if this were to be approved tonight, the fees to current license holders goes unchanged.
Correct, because until they renew, they don't come under this.
And new pricing could become effective as soon as January first.
And our licensing actually goes through the end of February, which is our fiscal year. So whatever modifications we make to the fee schedule really don't matter in the immediate sense.
So we can do it two-step.
Right.
Yes,
Yep, because we'd be modifying the fee schedule effective March 1st anyway, and so this would just fit right into it. Are we at the point where we should have a motion?
I just wanted to say two more things. One was to say we have gone through a 3-month process with this, and I'm very grateful to staff and to our council for walking us through. It's really a significant modernization of our code and much needed. So thank you. And then the second thing was I got more comfortable with your concept of we can always refuse the bazaar, and that will be in my head forever, and that actually sort of, that got me to a comfort level, so thank you.
Why were you looking at me when you said bazaar?
You said bazaar. No, that was what you said. I would never do that.
You can also embrace the desire.
Yes,
We have to
good
make
point.
a modification to the motion. Steve? If the board is inclined to make the ordinance changes, I believe that we need to make a modification to the motion, because I believe the item on the agenda not only makes the ordinance changes, but also amends the fee resolution. So if we're not ready to make that amendment to the fee resolution, does that have to be separated?
My understanding is that they would adopt or consider adoption
Okay.
of everything as is,
All right.
with the understanding that within the next couple of months, you take a specific look at the fee component of this, along with perhaps other
Got it.
fees.
Because
Thank you.
even though we adopted it, doesn't go in effect until March 1, and by March 1, we will have reviewed and made a decision whether we want to change it along with all other fees.
But you need the fee component immediately, because if on October 1, a company were to come along for a brand new license, you'd need to have all parts of it together.
So that's
I move to approve the ordinance as drafted.
A second.
roll call, please.
Trustee Cornell.
Yes.
Trustee Miller.
Yes.
Trustee Mulvaney.
Yes.
Trustee Pierce.
Yes.
Trustee Thomas.
Yes.
Trustee Vree.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Our last order of business is to adjourn to executive session for the purpose of discussing under the Open Meetings Act, OMA Section 2C2, collective bargaining negotiating matters between the village and its employee, and under Section 2C5, the purchase or lease of real property for use of the village. Do I have a motion to so? Roll call.
Trustee Cornell.
Yes.
It's slightly different than what's printed on the agenda if you're looking for it.
No.
Actually, we probably are going to stop
Right.
posting it on the agenda in that way.
We probably will
If
just
I-
have the executive.
Before you
session.
complete the roll, let me just explain the 2 points. One, you don't even have to include on the agenda that there is an executive session. You could adjourn to executive session at any time. It may be out of courtesy to your time schedules, and those in the audience, if you know that there's one going to be in advance, we'll include it. My recommendation would be not to include the subject matter, but because of an enhanced review by our Attorney General on adhering strictly to the schedule, my firm is going to be providing to all of our towns
a very specific way to go into executive session. You've heard it tonight. You're gonna see a specific recitation to the number and a better explanation as to the reason that will be stated out loud prior to a roll call vote. And we're trying to be my recommendation for you to adhere to that. So notwithstanding what's on the agenda tonight, the motion would supersede.
We would move to a generic call out for executive session going forward.
Excuse me?
We would move to a generic call out for executive session going forward.
On the printed agenda?
On the printed agenda, but before you go into executive session, you'll be very clear,
The motion will be the way
even
that we
clearer
laid
than
it
you
out.
have been.
It's just what
It's
goes
a
on the agenda
modification
that's
process.
published would be different.
So you were in the middle of a roll call, but I hope that
I
that
it
provides.
just seems, like, I know you don't have to put anything in here, but it seems more problematic when you put half of it in here and not all.
Well, issues have come up since the agenda was printed, and again, as Steve articulated, the actual notation on the agenda,
I know.
I understand your point, but
Let me suggest it would have been problematic if the item on the agenda was not one of the two that, for which we were going into executive
I
session.
think as long as he said it, just recognize that different council says different things. And I just wanna make sure this is right, not that I don't believe Steve.
But
I am-
if we have a,
I'm absolutely comfortable and confident that this is correct, that you are acting lawfully.
Yes.
if we move to a generic call out, does that give us any issues with the notice provision?
No,
No, because
because you can go and, you don't even have to have anything on
correct,
it.
you can have something come up in a meeting where you say, we need to go into executive session and just move.
And that gives
President
you
can move
the
that.
flexibility to bring up the issue of the day if there's a pressing crisis.
And also, we're gonna start calling it closed session. The word executive session doesn't appear in the Open Meeting Act, but we'll put together a nice,
we're actually in the just not to add on to this fun conversation, we're in the process of amending the entire agenda and updating it, and so we're going to be looking at that over the next several months and fixing some things.
I'm sure we'd be happy to try suggestions.
Sure.
We'd like to
Happy to
solicit
take
that.
them, happy to take them. Did I hear Trustee Cornell, you respond to the roll call? So you said yes, okay. Trustee Miller,
Yes.
Trustee Mulvaney, Trustee Pierce,
Yes.
Trustee Thomas,
Yes.
Trustee Vree.
Yes.
We are adjourned into closed session.